take this kiss upon the brow, and in parting from you now, thus much let me avow. You are not wrong who deem that my days have been a dream. Yet if hope has flown away, in a night or in a day, in a vision or in none, is it therefore the less gone? All that we see or seem is but a dream within a dream.
One evening in mid-January 1842, Edgar is relaxing with Maria, listening to his wife sing and play the piano, when suddenly Virginia coughs up blood. It is a sure sign she has the dreaded disease, tuberculosis. She is just 19 years old. One could only imagine the horror Edgar must have felt.
Then one night, everything changed. It was early 1842, and the Poes were sitting together playing music. Edgar on his flute, Virginia was playing the piano, and she started coughing up blood. So much blood, in fact, that Edgar thought that she had burst a blood vessel. And he despaired for her health. He knew that she'd be dead soon, that this really was a death sentence. She had consumption. Now he taught tuberculosis, that over time she would waste away, struggling to breathe, coughing up blood and bits of lung. So at once she was alive and dead.
Tuberculosis, or consumption, as it was commonly called, was the cause of more deaths in the industrialized world than any other disease at the time. It was consumption that had taken Edgar's mother and brother.
February 3rd, 1842, Philadelphia. My dear friend, my dear little wife has been dangerously ill. About a fortnight since, in singing, she ruptured a blood vessel, and it was only on yesterday that the physicians gave me any hope of her recovery. You might imagine the agony I have suffered, for you know how devotedly I love her.
Poe's magazine boss, George Graham, recalled,
I rode out one summer evening with them, and the remembrance of his watchful eyes eagerly bent upon the slightest change of hue in that loved face haunts me yet, as the memory of a sad strain. It was the hourly anticipation of her loss that made him a sad and thoughtful man, and lent a mournful melody to his undying song.
She was not a healthy woman. At irregular intervals, even while we were talking, she was attacked with a terrible paroxysm of coughing. This was so severe at times as to threaten her with strangulation.
Consumption accounted for up to 1/4 of all deaths in 19th century America, often afflicting the young. This ordeal undoubtedly influenced Poe's tale, The Mask of the Red Death, published in Graham's magazine just 4 months later.
The Red Death had long devastated the country. No pestilence had ever been so fatal or so hideous. Blood was its avatar and its seal. The redness and the horror of blood. There were sharp pains and sudden dizziness, and then profuse bleeding at the pores with dissolution. And the whole seizure, progress, and termination of the disease were the incidents of half an hour.
Prince Prospero summons 1,000 of his courtiers to take refuge in his castle. They lock down the castle's gates to keep the plague out.
The external world could take care of itself. In the meantime, it was folly to grieve or to think. The prince had provided all the appliances of pleasure. There were buffoons, there were improvisatori, there were ballet dancers, there were musicians, there was beauty, there was wine. All these and security were within. Without was the Red Death. It was toward the close of the 5th or 6th month of his seclusion, and while the pestilence raged most furiously abroad, that Prince Prospero entertained his 1,000 friends at a masked ball of the most unusual magnificence.
The ball is staged in 7 rooms, each painted a different color. In the 7th room is a large ebony clock that chimes on the hour. When the clock chimes midnight, a mysterious figure enters the room, dressed as a victim of the Red Death, instantly striking fear in all.
His vesture was dabbled in blood, and his broad brow, with all the features of the face, was besprinkled with the scarlet horror.
Horrified and insulted, Prince Prospero attacks him with a dagger. When the figure turns to him,
there was a sharp cry, and the dagger dropped gleaming upon the sable carpet, upon which instantly afterwards fell prostrate in death the Prince Prospero. And now was acknowledged the presence of the Red Death. He had come like a thief in the night, and one by one dropped the revelers in the blood-bedewed halls of their revel, and died each in the despairing posture of his fall. And the life of the ebony clock went out with that of the last of the gay, and the flames of the tripod expired, and darkness, and decay, and the Red Death held illimitable dominion over all.
Yeah, I think The Mask of the Red Death is a great example of a way in which he's referring to something very concrete and historically specific, but opening that up onto a totally existential register. So it's kind of supernatural and also very, very grounded in the particulars of what's going on at the time.
On the 6th of March, 1842, the acclaimed British author Charles Dickens visits Philadelphia as part of his wildly popular American tour. The two authors meet at the United States Hotel and discuss the state of American poetry. It would be the beginning of a warm friendship. Charles Dickens was one of the only major writers Poe met in person. And they had something in common: the need for an international copyright law. Under existing law, American works could be copyrighted, but not English or European ones. This meant that American publishers paid American writers very little because they could publish writers like Charles Dickens and many others for free. Poe wrote,
"Without an international copyright law, American authors may as well cut their throats."
Meanwhile, thanks to Poe's superb editing, original stories, and insightful reviews, Graham's magazine skyrockets from 5,000 subscribers to 40,000, making the owner George Graham a very wealthy man with a $25,000 profit. Poe's salary, however, remained at a paltry $800, which was not enough to support his family. Tired of working so hard for low wages and what he considered a middlebrow magazine, Poe quits in the spring of 1842. He renews his dream of starting his own magazine, one that would raise the standards of American letters. He writes to a friend,
"The project of the new magazine still, you may be sure, occupies my thoughts. If I live, I will accomplish it, and in triumph."
His new magazine would be called The Stylus, and he soon issues a prospectus. But nothing comes of it. Still, Poe would keep trying for the rest of his life. It was at this time that he pens one of his most terrifying stories, The Pit and the Pendulum, which describes the narrator's experience of torture as a victim of the Spanish Inquisition. The story studies the effect of terror on the mind, which this black and white French film brilliantly evokes through its skilled use of light and shadows.
I was sick, sick unto death with that long agony. And when they at length unbounded me, and I was permitted to sit, I felt that my senses were leaving me. The sentence, the dread sentence of death, was the last of distinct accentuation which reached my ears.
Unlike other Poe tales that rely on the supernatural, this story inspires fear in the reader by focusing on the senses.
I thrust my arms wildly above and around me in all directions. I felt nothing, yet dreaded to move a step lest I should be impeded by the walls of a tomb. Perspiration burst from every pore and stood in cold big beads upon my forehead. The agony of suspense grew at length intolerable, and I cautiously moved forward with my arms extended and my eyes straining from their sockets in the hope of catching some faint ray of light. I proceeded for many paces, but still all was blackness and vacancy. In the confusion attending my fall, I did not immediately apprehend a somewhat startling circumstance. I put forward my arm and shuddered to find that I had fallen at the very brink of a circular pit. Groping about the masonry just below the margin, I succeeded in dislodging a small fragment and let it fall into the abyss. For many seconds I hearkened to its reverberations as it dashed against the sides of the chasm in its descent. At length there was a sullen plunge into water, succeeded by loud echoes. At the same moment there came a sound resembling the quick opening and as rapid closing of a door overhead, while a faint gleam of light flashed suddenly through the gloom and as suddenly faded away. I saw clearly the doom which had been prepared for me, and congratulated myself upon the timely accident by which I had escaped. Another step before my fall, and the world had seen me no more.
His torturers subject him to a sharp pendulum that descends ever closer, and swarms of rats.
The vibration of the pendulum was at right angles to my length. I saw that the crescent was designed to cross the region of the heart. It would return and repeat its operations again and again. Down, still unceasingly, still inevitably down. I gasped and struggled at each vibration. I shrunk convulsively at its every sweep. My eyes followed its outward or upward whirls with the eagerness of the most unmeaning despair. Oh, how unspeakable.
This is a Poe story, after all. This is the guy who the previous year had invented the detective story. So this is a guy, Poe, whose character is going to overcome the horrors, the psychological torture with reason and analysis. He actually walks around the room measuring the diameter of the room, trying to find out, well, how much space do I have to look at? When he finds himself strapped down the table, about to be chopped in half by that giant pendulum blade, what does he do? He starts to use his reason. How can I escape this? So this is a mixture maybe of science fiction, the horror story, and the detective story. That's one of Poe's specialties.
I think Poe was a master at taking one fictional conceit, kind of setting up a little fictional world with certain parameters, and then taking it to the logical extreme, in fact, so realistically that it becomes almost fantastic or supernatural. So The Pit and the Pendulum would be one example of that. We see that same strategy in short story writers of the 20th century, like Kafka, for example, where things start to get really weird and supernatural precisely because they're so realistic. So it's this kind of mix of realism and supernatural together, and I think Poe really achieves that in The Pit and the Pendulum.
In spring 1843, the family moves into this home in the Spring Garden neighborhood in Philadelphia. It is here where he may have begun his tale, The Premature Burial, that speaks to the fear of being buried alive, that was rooted in 19th century culture.
Poe was working in the magazine and newspaper business, so he was constantly exposed to what's going on in the news. And he had to be abreast of everything that's going around him, and something that made headlines pretty frequently was premature burial. It didn't have to happen that often. Could be just 1 in a million cases, but when it did happen, it made the newspapers. So if you look back through newspapers, the 1840s, you'll see these accounts of people in a cemetery. They're at a funeral and they hear moaning coming from a nearby grave. They dig it up and say, oops, we buried somebody alive there. Or they place a body in a crypt. Then years later, they go back to place another coffin in the crypt and find out, oh, that first coffin's moved. And they find out there's scratch marks on the inside of the coffin as if that person has struggled to escape.
Being buried alive is one of the most horrific ways of dying, I think. And it did happen. Poe read about it. He wrote Berenice, where he incorporated the theme of being buried alive. And it seemed like everybody knew someone who lived next door to someone who was related to someone who heard about someone that was buried alive. Everybody had a story to tell. It's fair to say that people were, worried about it. And it happened to such a degree that coffin makers designed what they called life-preserving coffins. And after all these years of talking about this, I still have to smile when you think about building a coffin, not for a corpse, but for a living person.
The story is about a man who suffers from catalepsy that occasionally paralyzes him. He lives in fear of being mistaken dead and buried alive.
I hesitated to ride, or to walk, or to indulge in any exercise that would carry me from home. Among other things, I had the family vault so remodeled as to admit of being readily opened from within. To be buried while alive is, beyond question, the most terrific of these extremes which has ever fallen to the lot of mere mortality. The boundaries which divide life from death are at best shadowy and vague. Who shall say where the one ends and where the other begins?
It is in this house where Edgar takes care of Virginia, who would sometimes improve, but only to slip back. He later revealed to a friend,
I became insane, with long intervals of horrible sanity. During these fits of absolute unconsciousness, I drank. God only knows how often or how much. My enemies referred the insanity to the drink, rather than the drink to the insanity.
Poe's devotion to Virginia, in spite of their trying circumstances, is conveyed in this melodramatic, silent film directed by D.W. Griffith in 1909. When this short was released, it was before there were any films made in Hollywood. From this home, Poe makes one of his only trips to the nation's capital to directly petition President John Tyler for a patronage job at the Philadelphia Customs House in hopes of gaining greater financial security. As there was no civil service exam in those days, job seekers needed to petition the president himself. The United States did not adopt a civil service exam until 1883, after a failed office seeker assassinated President James A. Garfield 2 years before. But Poe's trip to Washington was a disaster, as his imp of the perverse reemerged. Perhaps sensing there was more opportunity in New York, Poe and his family soon set their sights on returning to the bustling city up north. He did not realize he was about to become the most famous poet in America. Soon after Edgar and Virginia arrive in New York, Poe writes his mother-in-law, Maria, affectionately called Muddy, who would remain back in Philadelphia with Katerina, their tortoise-shell cat.
Just after breakfast. My dear Muddy, We have just this minute done breakfast, and I now sit down to write you about everything. I feel in excellent spirits, and haven't drank a drop. You can't imagine how much we both do miss you. Sissy had a hearty cry last night because you and Katerina weren't here. We are resolved to get 2 rooms the first moment we can. In the meantime, it is impossible we could be more comfortable or more at home than we are. Give our best loves to Katerina.
In summer 1844, the Poes rent 2 rooms on the 2nd floor of the Brennan farmhouse. It is surrounded by a 200-acre working farm that stretches from what is now Central Park to the Hudson River. It was an isolated existence. He later told a friend that he had been living like a hermit in rural Manhattan and had not seen anyone but his family. Around this time, Poe writes a letter to the prominent poet James Russell Lowell, revealing something procrastinators everywhere can relate to.
My dear Mr. Lowell, I can feel for the constitutional indolence of which you complain, for it is one of my own besotting sins. I am excessively slothful and wonderfully industrious by fits. There are epochs when any kind of mental exercise is torture, and when nothing yields me pleasure but solitary communion with the mountains and the woods. I have thus rambled and dreamed away whole months, and awake at last to a sort of mania for composition. Then I scribble all day and read all night, so long as the disease endures.
In the fall, Poe joins the editorial staff of the New York Evening Mirror, a daily newspaper. He works there 5 months as an assistant editor.
Poe, while he worked at the Evening Mirror, did what he did at most of the magazines and newspapers he worked for. He was an editor, he wrote copy, he wrote stories, he wrote reviews. And he's only there for a short time. He hated working for editors. He thought most of them were mediocre, and he hated having to subordinate himself to someone else's judgment, particularly about literature, which he cared the most about. And he had fallen out with the editor and wanted to pursue other opportunities.
Where the farmhouse once stood is now this residential building on 84th and Broadway, the heart of the Upper West Side in Manhattan. It is at this farmhouse that he is to write his most beloved work that would establish him as one of the most famous poets in America. The Raven is about a scholar who is left desolate by the death of his beloved Lenore. He tries to put the memory of Lenore out of his mind by reading forgotten lore, but is unable to do so. He vows not to repeat her name, but does so often. One dreary December night, he is visited by an ominous bird.
Once upon a midnight dreary, while I pondered, weak and weary, over many a quaint and curious volume of forgotten lore, while I nodded, nearly napping, suddenly there came a tapping, as of someone gently rapping at my chamber door. "'Tis some visitor," I muttered, tapping at my chamber door. Only this, and nothing more. Distinctly I remember, it was in the bleak December, and each separate dying ember wrought its ghost upon the floor. Eagerly I wished the morrow. Vainly I had sought to borrow from my books surcease of sorrow. Sorrow for the lost Lenore, for the rare and radiant maiden whom the angels name Lenore, nameless here forevermore. Presently my soul grew stronger, hesitating then no longer. "Sir," said I, "or madam, truly your forgiveness I implore. But the fact is I was napping, and so gently you came rapping, and so faintly you came tapping, tapping at my chamber door, that I scarce was sure I heard you. Here I opened wide the door. Darkness there, and nothing more. Deep into that darkness peering, long I stood there, wondering, fearing, doubting, dreaming dreams no mortal ever dared to dream before. But the silence was unbroken, and the stillness gave no token, and the only word there spoken was the whispered word, Lenore? This I whispered, and an echo murmured back the word, Lenore. Merely this, and nothing more. Open here I flung the shutter, when with many a flirt and flutter, in there stepped a stately raven of the saintly days of yore. Not the least obeisance made he, not a minute stopped or stayed he, but with mien of lord or lady, perched above my chamber door, perched upon a bust of Pallas just above my chamber door, perched and sat, and nothing more.
Poe later explained that the raven symbolized a mournful and never-ending remembrance. The poem dramatizes the conflict between remembrance and forgetting. If the raven symbolizes never-ending grief, the bust of Pallas Athena signifies intellectual wisdom and scholarship. The raven, perched on Athena's marble bust, conveys grief over hope, the scholar's rationality eclipsed by the raven's dark message of nevermore that only deepens the scholar's melancholy and even overtakes his soul. How much did Virginia's progressive illness and Poe's anticipation of her death figure into the poem?
The Raven is very clearly an attempt to do some kind of proactive processing, I think we would call it now, anticipating the loss of Virginia and trying to understand how it would prey upon him and change his life, how he could come to terms with it. And so he conceived of this extraordinary poem that in one sense is theatrical and gimmicky and very easy to parody. There were dozens of parodies that popped up in the newspapers right away. But the thing is that the poem captures something powerful, and it lies in the torment of the poet, his desire to forget, but his compulsion to remember.
Desperate to learn if he will reunite with his beloved Lenore after death, the scholar receives no relief from the raven.
But the raven still beguiling my sad fancy into smiling. Straight I wheeled a cushioned seat in front of bird and bust and door. Then upon the velvet sinking, I betook myself to linking fancy unto fancy, thinking, what this ominous bird of yore, what this grim, ungainly, ghastly, gaunt, and ominous bird of yore meant in croaking nevermore. Prophet, said I, thing of evil, prophet still, if bird or devil, whether tempter sent or whether tempest tossed thee here ashore, desolate yet all undaunted, on this desert land enchanted, on this home by horror haunted. Tell me truly, I implore, is there balm in Gilead? Tell me, I implore. Quoth the raven, nevermore. Be that word our sign in parting, bird or fiend, I shrieked, upstarting. Get thee back into the tempest and the night's Plutonian shore. Leave no black plume as a token of that lie thy soul hath spoken. leave my loneliness unbroken. Quit the bust above my door. Take thy beak from out my heart, and take thy form from off my door. Quoth the raven, nevermore. And the raven, never flitting, still is sitting on the pallid bust of Pallas just above my chamber door. And his eyes have all the seeming of a demon's that is dreaming, and the lamplight o'er him streaming throws his shadow on the floor. And my soul from out that shadow that lies floating on the floor shall be lifted nevermore.
At the heart of grief is a lot of anger. And I think when the speaker explodes and shouts at the raven and tells it to leave, what he's trying to banish there is his own grief. Poe had that problem throughout his career. How to get rid of the grief that won't go away.
Interestingly, in his essay, The Philosophy of Composition, Poe viewed the scholar's hopeless inability to forget as pleasurable. He is impelled in part to continually question the raven by
that species of despair which delights in self-torture. He experiences a frenzied pleasure in so modeling his questions as to receive from the expected nevermore the most delicious because the most intolerable of sorrow.
The poem is widely praised for its haunting imagery, supernatural atmosphere, and mesmerizing musicality. Sadly, despite having penned the most popular poem in American history for the Evening Mirror, the newspaper where Poe works, he only receives $9.
People knew who he was. His nickname became the Raven. And it wasn't uncommon for him to be walking down the streets of New York, and children would come up running behind him with sticks and be hitting his heels. And you know what he did? He would turn around and go, "Nevermore!" And the kids would be permanently damaged, by the scream. They would be running down the street yelling and screaming. Poe had a sense of humor. I'm sure he thought that was funny. And maybe even the kids at one point laughed. Maybe they knew that they were doing that just to get a reaction from him.
The Raven was reprinted throughout the country. It made him instantly famous, a popular public speaker, and sought-after literary figure in New York's fashionable salons. One fascinating but often overlooked aspect of Edgar Allan Poe is his role as a pioneer of the science fiction genre. One critic extolled Poe as the source, the first genuine science fiction writer. Famed French author Jules Verne called Poe the creator of the scientific novel. So, how did Poe influence the genre? And what exactly is science fiction? Although there are varying definitions of science fiction, a useful one is applying the scientific thinking and knowledge of the time to a work of fiction. Poe accomplished this in many of his stories. He also influenced the two fathers of science fiction, Jules Verne and H.G. Wells, who, along with Mary Shelley, author of Frankenstein, helped establish the genre.
Not the only one, and arguably not the first, but he was at the very beginning of the flourishing of a genre that in some ways was inevitable with the rise of science. So many discoveries were taking place in the 19th century vis-a-vis what we know about the world, what we know about the natural order, what we know about human physiology.
Back in Baltimore in 1833, he penned a hoax titled The Unparalleled Adventures of One Hans Pfaall. that uses scientific thinking of the day to lend authenticity to the tale. The story tells of a poor bellows repairman from Rotterdam, Holland, who, to escape his persistent creditors, travels for 19 days to the moon via a revolutionary design balloon. It is equipped with a special device to compress the vacuum of outer space into breathable air. 5 years later, a lunar inhabitant is sent back with a message from Fall.
I have much to say of the climate of the planet, of its wonderful alternations of heat and cold, of unmitigated and burning sunshine for one fortnight, and more than polar frigidity for the next.
Indeed, the cold lunar night does last 2 weeks, as does the hot lunar day. Poe's story later inspired Jules Verne's space travel novel, From the Earth to the Moon. In another science fiction story, The Balloon Hoax, Poe describes a 3-day transatlantic flight newly completed by the hot air balloon Victoria, with 8 aeronaut men aboard. Poe uses extraordinary detail describing their flight as they cross the Atlantic Ocean to arrive near Charleston, South Carolina. Printed in an extra edition of the New York Sun, the account was accompanied by a detailed drawing of the balloon, along with exact specs. The story was so convincing with its scientific knowledge and technical details, many readers completely believed the hoax and swarmed the New York Sun building to urgently learn more. The first transatlantic crossing by hot air balloon would not actually occur until 1978, when 3 Americans crossed from Maine to France over 5 days aboard Double Eagle II. Poe's story partly inspired Jules Verne to write his first novel, 5 Weeks in a Balloon.
Poe had a huge impact on the science fiction genre because what he did was he took fantastic stories about trips to the moon or balloon trips across the ocean and tried to make them seem as if they could actually happen. What he did, since he knew the leading scientists and engineers of his day, was he tried to find out everything he could about the latest technology and use those details in his fiction. So if he's going to write a story about traveling across the ocean in a hot air balloon, he's going to research who's the leading balloonist of the day? Monk Mason. Poe actually made Monk Mason a character in his story. And he went into great detail describing the altitude he'd have to fly, what it's like being up in the air, and how the technology would even make it possible to cross the ocean in just 3 days.
In the apocalyptic short story, The Conversation of Eros and Charmian, 2 spirits, renamed Eros and Charmian after death, discuss how the world ended. Eros, who died in the apocalypse, explains how an incoming comet poisoned the atmosphere, causing life on Earth to end. In the narrative of Arthur Gordon Pym of Nantucket, Poe infuses his novel with input drawn from nonfiction written by scientists and explorers of the day. Unhappy with the ending, Jules Verne published a sequel called An Antarctic Mystery. Poe's novel also influenced H.G. Wells. He learned from Poe how to best craft a story, including what elements are most needed. Verne's super successful novel, Around the World in 80 Days, was influenced by Poe's clever short story, 3 Sundays in a Week, in which a young man must somehow find a week with 3 Sundays in it to receive his uncle's blessing to get married. Poe's Milanta Tauta, set 1,000 years in the future, describes a time when mile-high balloons transport up to 400 passengers at 150 miles per hour and looks back satirically on the past. The main character contrasts contemporary science and philosophy to that of 1848, but she misunderstands ideas in outlandish ways.
And it's about someone in the future, looking at our society today and saying how ridiculous it is. So Poe is very influential in that regard, in kind of centering this interest in time travel and futuristic themes that become very popular in Jules Verne and other writers. But I also see in Poe, in that tale, he's kind of the progenitor of a lot of the dystopian science fiction that he's writing kind of with, at least in that story, with a kind of political bent where he's satirizing democracy. He views it as a race to the bottom where mediocrity reigns.
In 1845, in this house near Washington Square Park, Poe wrote the science fiction story, The Facts in the Case of M. Valdemar, about a mesmerist who wants to learn if he can use the mesmeric trance to extend the life of his dying friend, Monsieur Valdemar.
It was evident that so far, death, or what is usually termed death, had been arrested by the mesmeric process. It seemed clear to us all that to awaken M. Valdemar would be merely to ensure his instant, or at least his speedy, dissolution. From this period until the close of last week, an interval of nearly 7 months, the sleepwalker remained exactly as I have last described him.
Hugo Gemsbach, who coined the term science fiction, and for whom the annual Hugo Science Fiction Awards are named, featured this story in the very first science fiction magazine in 1926. In 1845, Poe begins work at the Broadway Journal in Lower Manhattan. This was a more serious journal, one that emphasized literary reviews, art, and poetry, but had a smaller circulation. By October, Edgar very briefly achieves his longtime dream of becoming an owner and editor of a literary journal, but does so mainly through loans. It was during this short time he meets a young poet named Walt Whitman, who stops by the Broadway Journal, which had recently published his poem. Walt Whitman was one of the only major American writers that Poe met in person. While Poe had dramatically increased subscribers for journals owned by others, he could not replicate the success for his own magazine. He also started drinking again, and unable to cover his debts, he loses the magazine in just 2 months.
Unfortunately, Poe gains proprietorship of the Broadway Journal because the other editors kind of knew, and the other owners knew that it was losing money and that they wanted to cut their losses and run. So Poe is left alone with this, and he's editing, he's writing copy, and he doesn't really have any business acumen, and he's worked to the bone, so he loses it very quickly.
Losing the Broadway Journal was an especially sad event in his life. It would be his last regular position. One former employer remarked that Poe now wandered
from publisher to publisher with his fine print-like manuscript, but finding no market for his brain. He was troubled by those morbid feelings which a life of poverty and disappointment is so apt to engender in the heart of a man. The sense of having been ill-used, misunderstood, and put aside by men of far less ability.
Back home, Virginia's health takes a turn for the worse. For Valentine's Day, 1846, she writes a romantic acrostic for Edgar about her desire to lead a tranquil life with him in the country, with the first letter of each line spelling out his full name. This is the only verse she is known to have written.
Ever with thee I wish to roam. Dearest, my life is thine. Give me a cottage for my home and a rich old cypress vine. Removed from the world with its sin and care and the tattling of many tongues. Love alone shall guide us when we are there. Love shall heal my weakened lungs. And oh, the tranquil hours we'll spend, never wishing that others may see. Perfect ease we'll enjoy without thinking to lend ourselves to the world and its glee. Ever peaceful and blissful we'll be.
Virginia's wish comes true. Poe moves his family to a snug cottage in the rural village of Fordham, where they will live out their final days together. Located 14 miles north of the city, this modest two-story frame building, which today exists as a museum, would be Poe's final home. A kitchen, sitting room, and small bedroom were on the first floor. Poe's study and the bedroom he shared with Virginia were on the second. Muddy later recalled that Edgar spent the mornings writing at his desk, then worked in the flower garden or recited poetry to her and Sissy.
Oh, how supremely happy we were in our dear cottage home. We three lived only for each other.
Poe kept songbirds on a small front porch surrounded by lilacs and cherry trees. The peaceful setting and the countryside where he loved to take walks inspired his writing. One visitor recalled that Poe composed his works with his beloved cat, Katerina, wrapped around his shoulders.
I'm smiling because this is such a human aspect of Poe that many people either don't want to imagine or to see, but apparently they were playing in the backyard and playing hop frog, or leapfrog rather. And Poe would jump over Virginia and then she would jump over him. Well, apparently he split his pants doing that, and Virginia couldn't stop laughing to see, Eddie with his split pants. And again, how many people can see Edgar playing leapfrog? Again, this is just getting back to, did they love each other? They were playful. They weren't ashamed to be doing something that children would be doing. And I just think it's so sweet.
In the fall, Poe is enmeshed in a bitter literary quarrel, a common occurrence for him, with the writer Thomas Dunn English. Poe felt English had wronged him and accused him and the owners of the Evening Mirror of libel. This bitter dispute influenced one of Poe's finest stories, that is a meditation on the art and passion of revenge.
The 1,000 injuries of Fortunato I had borne as best I could, but when he ventured upon insult, I vowed revenge. You, who so well know the nature of my soul, will not suppose, however, that I gave utterance to a threat. At length I would be avenged. I must not only punish, but punish with impunity.
On a carnival night in an unnamed Italian city, the narrator lures his inebriated enemy, Fortunato, deep into his family's wine cellar to evaluate if a cask of rare sherry is genuine.
It must be understood that neither by word nor deed had I given Fortunato cause to doubt my goodwill. I continued, as was my wont, to smile in his face, and he did not perceive that my smile now was at the thought of his immolation.
The two noblemen walk through the extensive family catacombs to locate the casket of sherry. Before the inebriated Fortunato realizes what is happening, the narrator manages to chain his victim to the wall and entomb him alive.
I soon uncovered a quantity of building stone and mortar. With these materials and with the aid of my trowel, I began vigorously to wall up the entrance of the niche. I had scarcely laid the first tier of the masonry when I discovered that the intoxication of Fortunato had in great measure worn off. My heart grew sick. On account of the dampness of the catacombs, I hastened to make an end of my labor. I forced the last stone into its position. I plastered it up. Against the new masonry, I re-erected the old rampart of bones. For the half of a century, no mortal has disturbed them. In pace requiescat.
Poe later claims revenge of his own when he wins his lawsuit and is awarded $225 in damages. In the only surviving letter written to Virginia, Poe writes about his great disappointment in losing the Broadway Journal and his dependence on her.
My dear heart, my dear Virginia, our mother will explain to you why I stay away from you this night. I trust the interview I am promised will result in some substantial good for me, for your dear sake and hers. Keep up your heart in all hopefulness, and trust yet a little longer. In my last great disappointment, I should have lost my courage, but for you, my darling little wife, you are my greatest and only stimulus now to battle with this uncongenial, unsatisfactory, and ungrateful life. I shall be with you tomorrow p.m., and be assured until I see you, I will keep in loving remembrance your last words and your fervent prayer. Sleep well, and may God grant you a peaceful summer with your devoted Edgar.
By moving to the country, Poe hoped this would improve Virginia's health, but it was not to be. By year's end, she increasingly found it hard to breathe. One visitor, Mary Gove Nichols, observed,
Mrs. Poe looked very young. She had large black eyes and a pearly whiteness of complexion, which was a perfect pallor. Her pale face, her brilliant eyes, and her raven hair gave her an unearthly look. One felt that she was almost a disrobed spirit. And when she coughed, it was made certain that she was rapidly passing away. Then fall came, and Mrs. Poe sank rapidly in consumption, and I saw her in her bedchamber. Everything here was so neat, so purely clean, so scant, and so poverty-stricken that I saw the sufferer with such a heartache as the poor feel for the poor. The weather was cold, and the sick lady had the dreadful chills that accompany the hectic fever of consumption. She lay on the straw bed, wrapped in her husband's greatcoat, with a large tortoise-shell cat on her bosom. The wonderful cat seemed conscious of her great usefulness. The coat and the cat were the sufferer's only means of warmth, except as her husband held her hands and her mother her feet.
On her deathbed, she thought only of her husband's well-being.
Darling, darling Muddy, you will console and take care of my poor Eddie. You will never, never leave him. Promise me, my dear Muddy, and then I can die in peace.
In January 1847, 5 years after she ruptured a blood vessel while singing, Virginia dies at 24, the same age as Edgar's mother and brother. In the months following his wife's death, Poe falls into a deep depression. One friend recalled,
"The loss of his wife was a sad blow to him. He did not seem to care after she was gone, whether he lived an hour, a day, a week, or a year. She was his all."
Edgar would sometimes visit Virginia's burial vault late at night, even in snow. He later composed a poem, Annabel Lee, in which the love between a young couple is so great, it evokes the envy of the angels in heaven and the demons under the sea, who put an early end to it. But their love extends beyond the grave.
It was many and many a year ago, in a kingdom by the sea, that a maiden there lived, whom you may know by the name of Annabel Lee. And this maiden she lived with no other thought than to love and be loved by me. I was a child, and she was a child in this kingdom by the sea. But we loved with a love that was more than love, I and my Annabel Lee, with a love that the winged seraphs of heaven coveted her and me. And this was the reason that long ago, in this kingdom by the sea, a wind blew out of a cloud, chilling my beautiful Annabel Lee, so that her highborn kinsman came and bore her away from me to shut her up in a sepulchre in this kingdom by the sea. The angels, not half so happy in hell, went envying her and me. Yes, that was the reason, as all men know in this kingdom by the sea, that the wind came out of the cloud by night, chilling and killing my Annabel Lee. But our love, it was stronger by far than the love of those who were older than we, of many far wiser than we, and neither the angels in heaven above, nor the demons down under the sea, can ever dissever my soul from the soul of the beautiful Annabel Lee. For the moon never beams without bringing me dreams of the beautiful Annabel Lee, and the stars never rise, but I feel the bright eyes of the beautiful Annabel Lee. And so all the night time I lie down by the side of my darling, my life and my bride, in her sepulchre there by the sea, in her tomb by the sounding sea.
In his well-known essay, The Poetic Principle, Poe argues that poetry's true purpose is to elevate the soul.
I need scarcely observe that a poem deserves its title, only inasmuch as it excites by elevating the soul. The value of the poem is in the ratio of this elevating excitement.
It was not poetry's role to offer a moral, as was commonly believed by Henry Wadsworth Longfellow and others in his day. Poe wrote that poetry could enable humanity to attain, at least temporarily, what he called supernow beauty, which hints at the glories beyond the grave.
For Poe, this was, at least in the realm of poetry, the highest calling to create this beauty that he had seen a few times in his life. And I think that beauty, he clearly connected with the idea of immortality. I think he believed that beauty would last, whatever else happens.
There is still a something in the distance which he has been unable to attain. We have still a thirst unquenchable. This thirst belongs to the immortality of man. It is no mere appreciation of the beauty before us, but a wild effort to reach the beauty above. Inspired by an ecstatic prescience of the glories beyond the grave, we struggle by multiform combinations among the things and thoughts of time to attain a portion of that loveliness whose very elements perhaps appertain to eternity alone. And thus, when by poetry, or when by music, the most entrancing of the poetic moods, we find ourselves melted into tears, we weep then, through a sorrow at our inability to grasp now, wholly, here on earth, at once and forever, those divine and rapturous joys, of which through the poem we attain to but brief and indeterminate glimpses. I would define, in brief, the poetry of words as the rhythmical creation of beauty.
He really thinks that the function of the poetic or the musical is to get us in touch, to glimpse these rare glimpses of joy or of beauty, and to also feel the loss of that possibility in everyday life. So he says that we glimpse in poetry what we cannot really ever fully grasp in everyday society. So poetry and music for him very closely aligned in terms of offering that glimpse that is possible only in art of the beautiful.
Edgar began working on something very different from anything he had ever created. It was a prose poem titled Eureka, an essay on the material and spiritual universe, in which he writes,
I designed to speak of the material and spiritual universe, of its essence, its origin, its creation, its present condition, and its destiny. I shall be so rash, moreover, as to challenge the conclusions, and thus, in effect, to question the sagacity of many of the greatest and most justly reverenced of men.
Some critics today believe the work anticipated modern science and cosmology, presciently describing the Big Bang and the expanding universe. One article from Scientific American notes that Eureka contains more than 20 ideas that were revolutionary in 1848, but are now part of everyday science, including the Big Bang, an expanding universe, ideas about the velocity of light, and black holes as the final phase of stars. In Poe's time, through the early 20th century, scientists believed in a static and clockwork universe. In this view, the cosmos is eternal and changeless. But Eureka was prescient in describing a universe that had a beginning and is continually expanding.
But his theory was different. He didn't see a static universe where all the stars and planets all just sat in one place. He imagined an expanding universe. If it's expanding, it must have all come from somewhere, from one really dense point, a very dense primordial particle.
The first scientist who may have used Poe's ideas was the Russian mathematician Alexander Friedman, who was a fan of Poe and likely read Eureka. Reflecting on the work may have inspired Friedman to perceive the true meaning of Einstein's field equations, that the universe is expanding, whereas other scientists, including Einstein, missed this. In 1922, Friedman published his pioneering theory and equations for an expanding universe, which set into motion a radical new understanding of how the universe works. 5 years later, the Belgian physicist and priest Georges Lemaitre first suggested the Big Bang, when he theorized that the universe began from a single, extraordinarily dense primordial atom that diversified as it expanded. Given Poe's popularity in Europe at the time, could Lemaitre have been inspired by Poe, who wrote in Eureka,
The assumption of absolute unity in the primordial particle includes that of infinite divisibility. From the one particle as a center, let us suppose to be irradiated spherically in all directions, to immeasurable but still definite distances in the previously vacant space, a certain inexpressibly great yet limited number of unimaginably yet not infinitely minute atoms.
I think that Poe has been located as a really important touchstone in the history of science for the way in which he identified intuition with scientific insight. So he was kind of trying to go beyond a kind of binary opposition between rational judgment and scientific discovery on the one hand and a more intuitive relationship to the truth on the other. And I think for him, poetry is a really great example of the two coming together.
However, Eureka barely sold and was largely ignored by the press. Few attended Poe's public lectures on the subject, which many found confusing. Yet time would prove many of his ideas correct. After Virginia's death, Poe grew more emotionally unstable. Orphaned at such a young age and the victim of so much loss, he desperately needed an anchor, a woman who would care for him, save himself from drinking, and who would have the means to finance the stylus, his lifelong dream of owning an influential literary journal. One woman Poe courts is 45-year-old fellow poet Sarah Helen Whitman of Providence, Rhode Island, who is exactly 6 years older than Poe. She was a widow with no children who lived with her mother and sister in this house. Helen was a spiritualist who attempted to communicate with the spirits of the dead, and later in life was said to have conducted seances at her home. An admirer of Poe's work, she and Edgar exchanged letters and poems for some time before Poe visits her in Providence in September 1848. They enjoy spending time together at the Providence Athenaeum.
I think she represented, like Virginia, someone that was devoted, that could have been devoted to him and that would have taken care of him. And this is what he's most looking for in the period after Virginia's death.
Just 2 days after meeting, as they are strolling in a cemetery, which were popular places for romantic couples of the period, Edgar proposes marriage. Helen is unsure and tells him she must think about it. The two have a stormy and intense courtship, in which Helen rejects numerous marriage proposals from Poe, spiraling him into depression and hopelessness. Her mother is staunchly against the marriage, believing that Poe is only after her money. And Helen is concerned about Edgar's drinking and potential infidelity. Her rejections even drive him to attempt suicide with laudanum. When he visits Providence a second time in November, Helen realizes his desperate condition and has a change of heart. She agrees to marry him. They plan a Christmas wedding, but on one condition: Poe must abstain from alcohol. On December 20th, Poe returns to Providence to speak on the poetic principle before a sold-out crowd of 1,800 people, with Helen sitting in the front row. The lecture impresses her profoundly. But on December 23rd, just 2 days before their wedding, the couple is in the Providence Athenaeum when Helen receives an anonymous note that Poe had been seen intoxicated the night before. His penchant for self-sabotage had reemerged, and he had broken his pledge. Poe made his final plea to her, but to no avail. The relationship was over. They would never see each other again. Another woman Poe pursues is 28-year-old Nancy Richmond of Lowell, Massachusetts, whom Edgar calls Annie. A kind and simple lady, Annie is married to a wealthy paper manufacturer and mother to a 3-year-old girl. Annie becomes a kind of emotional anchor for Poe as they develop a platonic romance. Edgar saw Annie as a caretaking, angelic sibling. One of his finest poems, For Annie, describes his suicide attempt and Annie's promise to come to his deathbed.
Thank heaven, the crisis, the danger is past, and the lingering illness is over at last, and the fever called living is conquered at last. The sickness, the nausea, the pitiless pain have ceased with the fever that maddened my brain, with the fever called living that burned in my brain.
In the final stanza, Poe credits his recovery to the devoted love expressed in the eyes of the kind Annie.
But my heart, it is brighter than all of the many stars in the sky, for it sparkles with Annie. It glows with the light of the love of my Annie, with the thought of the light of the eyes of my Annie.
In January 1848, gold was discovered at Sutter's Mill in Coloma, California. The following year, some 90,000 prospective gold miners rushed to California to seek their fortune. These 49ers, as they were called, ventured from all over the United States and abroad, half traveling by land, half by sea. The gold rush changed San Francisco from a tiny settlement of 200 residents in 1846 to a boomtown of 25,000 residents only 4 years later. Before 1848, the estimated non-Indian population of California was less than 1,000. By the end of 1849, it topped 100,000. This sudden population surge allowed California to become a state the following year as part of the Compromise of 1850. Poe's reaction to the gold rush is expressed in his poem El Dorado, which describes the failed journey of a gallant knight who has spent his life in search of the legendary city of gold, El Dorado. When an old man he meets a pilgrim shadow who points the way through the valley of the shadow, perhaps hinting that the real El Dorado lies in wisdom and spiritual understanding.
Gaily bedight, a gallant knight, in sunshine and in shadow, had journeyed long, singing a song, in search of El Dorado. But he grew old, this knight so bold, and o'er his heart a shadow fell as he found no spot of ground that looked like El Dorado. And as his strength failed him at length, he met a pilgrim's shadow. Shadow, said he, where can it be, this land of El Dorado? Over the mountains of the moon, down the valley of the shadow. Ride, boldly ride, the shade replied, if you seek for El Dorado.
There's a way in which Poe is wonderfully un-American. That may be precisely his importance to the American canon, is he refused to embrace a lot of the values that were taken for granted in the time. And that's also part of why it's been so hard to kind of make him fit into American literary history. And it really took outside figures like Baudelaire or later figures in the 20th century like Toni Morrison to really clarify ways in which Poe, precisely by not fitting the mold of American literature, really became the centerpiece for innovation in the coming centuries.
That same year, Poe composes one of his most famous poems, The Bells, that focuses purely on sound and the transformative nature of bells. This highly onomatopoeic poem transforms from the tinkling sound of sleigh bells to the chiming sound of wedding bells to the clamoring sound of fire alarm bells, to the tolling sound of funeral bells. The poem begins,
Hear the sledges with the bells, silver bells. What a world of merriment their melody foretells. How they tinkle, tinkle, tinkle in the icy air of night, while the stars that oversprinkle all the heavens seem to twinkle with a crystalline delight, keeping time, 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 in a sort of runic rhyme, to the tin-tin abulation that so musically wells from the bells, 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 from the jingling and the tinkling of the bells.
In the spring of 1849, Poe's luck finally turns. A wealthy printer from Illinois, Edward Patterson, offers to publish The Stylus, with Poe as half-owner and sole editor. His lifelong dream is now firmly in reach. As part of the agreement, Poe sets out on a speaking tour in Virginia to raise funds and find subscribers. But he also feels a sense of foreboding he cannot shake, revealing to his Massachusetts confidant Annie,
My sadness is unaccountable, and this makes me the more sad. I am full of dark forebodings. Nothing cheers or comforts me. My life seems wasted. The future looks a dreary blank.
According to Muddy, Edgar feared that this trip might be his last, that he, quote, might be called suddenly from the world. Poe delays the trip several times. Finally, on the 29th of June, Poe bids a tearful farewell to Muddy and departs New York for Richmond. After a harrowing journey, he arrives, where he soon gives a series of well-received readings to raise money and generate interest for the Stylus. Back in his boyhood city, he visits old haunts and acquaintances. The place soon brings back memories of his youthful love, Elmira Royster, who is now a wealthy widow and mother of 2 children. He decides to drop by unannounced one Sunday afternoon. Elmira later recalled,
I was ready to go to church, and a servant told me that a gentleman in the parlor wanted to see me. I went down and was amazed to see him, but knew him instantly. He came up to me in the most enthusiastic manner and said, Oh, Elmira, is this you? That very morning I told him I was going to church, that he must call again. And when he did call again, he renewed his addresses. I laughed at it. He looked very serious and said he was in earnest and had been thinking about it for a long time. Then I found out that he was very serious, and I became serious.
After a brief courtship, Edgar proposes to Elmira, but she postpones her response. To show his good faith, he joins the Richmond chapter of the Sons of Temperance. In the final letter Poe would ever write, he tells Muddy about Elmira and his success in Richmond.
Elmira has just got home from the country. I spent last evening with her. I think she loves me more devotedly than anyone I ever knew, and I cannot help loving her in return. Nothing is as yet definitely settled, and it will not do to hurry matters. On Tuesday, I start for Philadelphia to attend to Mrs. Loud's poems, and possibly on Thursday, I may start for New York. If I do, I will go straight over to Mrs. Lewis's and send for you. If possible, I will get married before I start, but there is no telling. My poor Muddy, I am still unable to send you even $1, but keep up heart. I hope that our troubles are nearly over. I showed your letter to Elmira, and she says it is such a darling, precious letter. that she loves you for it already. The papers here are praising me to death, and I have been received everywhere with enthusiasm. Your own, Eddie.
As Poe begins his journey on the 27th of September, his plan is to stop in Philadelphia for a lucrative editing job, then pick up Muddy in New York before returning to Richmond. The poet is in high spirits. The last few weeks in the society of old and new friends bring him much happiness. He is soon to marry a wealthy woman who loves him and whom he loves, who could finally give him the financial and emotional support he so desperately needs and escape a life of deprivation. And he is on the verge of realizing his lifelong dream of publishing The Stylus. When Poe arrives by steamship in Baltimore the next day, all he must do is take the train north for a new life that is awaiting him. If he had simply made the train connection, who knows what poems and tales he may have penned, what literary genres he may have invented, and what personal happiness he may have found. But he does not continue to Philadelphia. Instead, he vanishes into Baltimore's crowded and dangerous streets. What happens to Poe during the next 6 days is a mystery. His cousin Nielsen Poe, a Baltimore resident, later wrote Maria Clem,
At what time he arrived in the city, where he spent the time he was here, or under what circumstances, I have been unable to ascertain.
On the afternoon of October 3rd, a printer named Joseph Walker discovers Poe at Gunner's Hall, which once stood here. It was an Irish tavern that was serving as a polling place on Election Day. Poe is in a semi-conscious state, wearing somebody else's clothes. Could Poe have been a victim of cooping?
This theory has a few holes in it, was that he was a victim of cooping, political kidnapping. When Poe came to Baltimore, it was election time. And it was a popular practice, not only in Baltimore, but Philadelphia, New York. If you were running for office, you would hire thugs, and they would go out and kidnap people, usually drunken sailors, soldiers, and there were plenty of those to go around, strangers that were passing through like Poe, but they would never go after someone who was local for obvious reasons. They would be recognized. So the way it would work is you would kidnap this person and you would coop them up in the basement of a building and use them as a repeat voter. Now, in order for this to work, that person had to be plied with alcohol so they couldn't fight back. And so what they would do is they would take these people around in a wagon and they would vote for the same person over and over again. So the second time this person would go to vote, they would change the clothing, shave off a mustache, and that way the election judge could say, I never saw that guy before, he can vote, knowing that he was already voted 20, 30 times. And when that person got so drunk or out of it that he couldn't even put an X or he started fighting, they would dump you out on the street. So that would explain Poe's clothing, soiled, ripped, and being found at a polling place, a tavern. But that's a theory.
Recognizing Poe's urgent condition, Walker scribbles a note and dispatches it to Poe's longtime friend, Dr. Joseph Snodgrass, who rushes to the tavern to assist. Realizing Poe's life is in mortal danger, Snodgrass sends him by carriage to Washington Medical College, whose building still exists today. He is cared for by Dr. John Moran, the young resident physician, who later recounted in a letter,
When brought to the hospital, he was unconscious of his condition, who brought him or with whom he'd been associating. He remained in this condition from 5 o'clock in the afternoon, the hour of his admission, until 3 next morning. This was on the 3rd October. To this state succeeded tremor of the limbs, and at first a busy but not violent or active delirium, constant talking and vacant converse with spectral and imaginary objects on the walls. His face was pale and his whole person drenched in perspiration. We were unable to induce tranquility before the second day after his admission. Wishing to rally and sustain his now fast-sinking hopes, I told him I hoped that in a few days he would be able to enjoy the society of his friends here. At this, he broke out with much energy and said the best thing his best friend could do would be to blow out his brains with a pistol, that when he beheld his degradation, he was ready to sink in the earth. Mr. Poe seemed to doze, and I left him for a short time. When I returned, I found him in a violent delirium, resisting the efforts of 2 nurses to keep him in bed. This state continued until Saturday evening, when he commenced calling for one Reynolds, which he did through the night up to 3 on Sunday morning. At this time, a very decided change began to affect him. Having become enfeebled from exertion, he became quiet and seemed to rest for a short time. Then, gently moving his head, he said, "Lord help my poor soul," and expired.
Poe died at the Washington Medical College on Sunday, October 7th at 5 a.m., age 40. He was buried the next afternoon in Baltimore's Presbyterian Cemetery. Only 7 people attended his funeral, with the ceremony lasting a mere 3 minutes. One observer described it as cold-blooded and unchristian-like. Poe's coffin lacked a nameplate, a cloth lining, or even a cushion for his head. He was buried in the family plot that for many years had no headstone to identify him. Even in death, things only got worse for Poe. One of his biggest mistakes while alive was apparently appointing Rufus Griswold as his literary executor to oversee the posthumous publication of his works. It was a tragic misjudgment. Yet, it's also possible Poe did not appoint anybody to be his literary executor, and that Griswold essentially appointed himself. Griswold secretly despised Poe and took his revenge 2 days after the poet's death in an extremely damaging obituary in the New York Tribune that was widely reprinted. Poe had his defenders, but they were largely ignored, whereas Griswold, a respected anthologist who was, allegedly, his literary executor, was seen as authoritative. The following year, Griswold was merciless. He falsely claimed Poe had been expelled from the University of Virginia, deserted the U.S. Army, and had been addicted to drugs. The last charge still sticks today. Poe was vilified in the press. His supporters, including Sarah Helen Whitman, began the long journey of restoring his literary and personal reputation. 26 years later, in 1875, a memorial ceremony was organized in Baltimore as Poe was reinterred beneath a tombstone befitting one of America's greatest writers. And this is where Edgar Allan Poe lies today. He was later joined by his wife, Virginia, and his mother-in-law, Maria Clem. Eminent writers from around the world offered words of praise. Biographers at last began to write far truer accounts of Poe's life. Thanks to the translations of the French poet Charles Baudelaire, Poe became extremely popular in France. And there was yet another mystery. It happened every year since 1949 for 60 years, in the early hours of January 19th, on Poe's birthday.
The man was dressed in all black with a white scarf and black hat. Not a top hat, but just a regular hat. He would come into the graveyard, and sometimes he would go to the Poe's original grave in the back, sometimes up front. Usually, in the early years of us watching, he would go to the monument at the corner. He would come in, and he would place the flowers, place the cognac, and sometimes he would just stand there, maybe saying a prayer. Sometimes he would put his hand on Poe's face that's on the monument, and then he would remove it. Sometimes he would kneel, and then he would leave, and that was it. And when he would go into the back of the graveyard, he would come up to Poe's stone representing where Poe's original grave was. He would put his hand on it, put the roses and cognac, and then do the same thing, maybe just stand there for a moment, then he would leave. And that would be the routine year after year. And it never lost its magic for me, because I thought, here I am being privileged to watch this tribute that we think has been going on since 1949.
To this day, his identity remains a mystery. It took decades, but eventually, Poe was recognized for his genius, having pioneered 3 literary genres: the horror tale, the detective story, and science fiction. His critical essays helped establish the modern short story. He popularized cryptography and may have even contributed to our understanding of the universe. In time, Poe ranked among the most admired and beloved American literary figures. He has influenced writers and artists throughout the ages, even long after his troubled yet remarkable life.